Great, I think we can get started. So for those just joining, my name is Ann Connors. I'm Assistant Director in the Admissions Office. I'm joined by my colleague, Karen Cunningham. Karen and I are thrilled to welcome Jonathan Ruane all the way from Ireland today to talk about his studies and his teaching here at MIT Sloan. So with that, I'm going to leave it to you to kick it off.
Fantastic. Well, first, let me just double check that my technology is working. So, Karen or Anne, can you just come on the line and just let me know? Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're great.
That sounds great. Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you to the admissions team, to Anne and Karen in particular, for inviting me on to talk a little bit about some of the work I do at MIT. So I understand most of the people who are on the call today are interested in doing one of the various masters or postgrad programs here at Sloan. So what I'm going to try and do is really tell you a little bit about the type of work I do as just a small insight into the range of faculty who are here and the diverse range of work that we do. But I'm only going to shine a spotlight on one very narrow area, which is my domain. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a sample even of some of the content we actually cover in some of my classes and in some of my research to give you a better flavor for what, practically speaking, students at Sloan are studying today. I'll actually even show you some of the slides I've presented in class over the last couple of weeks to current students. As Anne said, we'll probably take questions towards the end, but feel free to put them into the chat, and then we'll get to them towards the end. But so why don't I get started and maybe just make sure the technology here is working. Tell you a little bit about myself. As you can probably hear, I'm originally from Ireland, but I've been at MIT now for about 5 years. And so I am a lecturer in what's called the Global Economics and Management Group at Sloan. And then I'm a research scientist at the Initiative on the Digital Economy, which is the IDE. So in an academic environment, this is kind of a typical setup for a scholar or an academic where you have some teaching work and you have some research work. So just to break that down a little bit more and maybe tell you about my own day-to-day job and how I'm interacting with students and with my academic research. I currently teach in this calendar year, in this academic year, I'll teach three classes that are broadly based at Sloan. But you'll hear more about how they intersect with other parts of the university as well. So the three courses are the Global Business of AI and Robotics. We shorten that to GBAR. So if you hear me talking about GBAR, that's GBAIR, GBAR, which is the Global Business of AI and Robotics. This year, we've been teaching that now for 3 or 4 years. We were probably one of, if not the first, universities in the world in the business school to start teaching a course on AI and robotics and its economic and its business impact. I'll talk more about the course and even, like I said, give you some sample material. That has been such a successful course. It's one of the most popular elective courses at Sloan for MBAs. And in fact, we get a lot of non-MBAs coming across, maybe PhDs in computer science, etc., who come across to Sloan to study as well. So typical numbers every year is give or take about 100 students. So very popular elective, probably in the top 10, 20% of electives in terms of student numbers. That has been a huge success, and this year I'm just launching with a colleague of mine from the engineering side of the house a new course on the global business of quantum computing, and we're going to explore that topic for the first time this year. On top of that, I'm currently right now in the middle of teaching a course called Collaborative Intelligence Ventures. And collaborative intelligence technologies essentially are technologies that involve human and machine interaction. So a lot of the more advanced robotics that we're starting to see come into the world are hardware versions of collaborative intelligence technologies, but also stuff like chatbots, AI, etc. And this is a course again that fits in very practically because it's got a high entrepreneurial um, uh, focus on it. It's about not just understanding these technologies and getting people in a room that are wanting to discuss them and understand where they're going, but also actually forming teams and ideally even companies around that. And I'll tell you a bit more about the $100,000 competition that we tag on as part of that course. So they're my three main courses that I'm teaching. On top of that, I do teach in other areas and other disciplines and even other universities. I'm adjunct professor at Trinity College Dublin, and I teach a course there called essentially an entrepreneurship course called Disciplined Entrepreneurship, which is an entire methodology, and it's rooted with a colleague of mine, Bill Aulett, in MIT. So I very much teach this at Trinity, but also it's heavily part of my discipline in MIT. And then I help out some of my colleagues who are the primary instructors in a number of other courses. So analytics lab, I'm a mentor on that. I have taught in the past on a bunch of other action learning lab classes, such as global entrepreneurship lab, which is I think still probably the biggest action learning lab at MIT. And then I teach a bunch of exec education courses as well. So that's kind of like all my teaching. That's the kind of work I focus on. On the research side of things, I'm part of the IDE, which is one of the largest research groups at MIT. And that really is a bunch of us who are interested in studying the impacts of this period that we're in right now of rapid digital transformation of our economies, our societies. And I focus on a bunch of areas around like how do firms change their strategy to bring in both entrepreneurial firms and incumbent firms. How do they adapt their strategy to make sure that they're taking advantage of the opportunities that are out there? I also look at things like new digital business models, such as platforms, look at how the digital economy is changing. So, stuff like that would be like how automation is changing the labor market and what that might mean for the future. So that's maybe a flavor for the kind of stuff that goes on in the research side of the house. So, you've heard about the type of things that I'm working on in terms of the various courses and the various research, and hopefully you'll start to see a theme across many of them. So why do I teach these courses? Why does Sloan want me here to teach these kind of classes? Why are students interested in this? And for me, the simple way of looking at it and is because technology has such a profound impact on our economy, on our businesses, on our industry, but also on the human condition. The lives that we are living today have been fundamentally changed because of technologies that have been developed, entrepreneurs that have released those technologies into the world, and then firms who continue to evolve and improve and disseminate and diffuse those technologies into the economy. So a colleague of mine, a very distinguished professor, Robert Solow, he's the Nobel laureate. I think he won a Nobel Prize in maybe 1987, and he's a professor here at MIT. He talks about technological development will be the motor for economic growth in the long run. And this is kind of an economist's way of saying technology is very, very important. And if we kind of if we think about technology being really important to our businesses and our societies and us as individuals, the kind of the one overarching framework, I guess, to some degree that supports this is how does technology come into markets? How does it come into our lives? Because we know that technology is constantly changing, right? But I really like this concept that's been around quite a while from an economist, Joseph Schumpeter, who talks about the idea of creative destruction. And this, I think, is really powerful because it blends together some of the main interests for me, which is around obviously the technology, but also the entrepreneurial action that kind of brings these technologies to life. And so what's this creative destruction? What is Schumpeter talking about? He called it the perennial gale of creative destruction. In other words, that it's constantly blowing. This is not something that you can turn off. Now, he was talking about this 50, 60 years ago. And really, creative destruction is all about new technologies, but it's not just about technologies. It could also be new products, new methods of production, new means of distribution. And it's all about basically making certain models obsolete, forcing companies to quickly adapt to new environments or fail. And when we zoom back out and think about this, it's a very important concept. But what does it mean practically speaking? Well, Let me just make sure that I've got on the right slides. Yeah. So let me give you a practical example of how that works over a long period of time and why we might care about something like creative destruction. Well, if you go back to the early 1900s, you're going to see US piano sales. If we just take that one market and have a look at it, what we're going to see is that pianos were the center of family entertainment, essentially in that era. For a middle class home in the United States, you wanted to have a piano there so that every evening you could spend your leisure time, maybe not every evening, but multiple evenings a week, spend your leisure time, generating entertainment. And, the number of pianos that were sold then were nearly approaching 400,000 per year. Then we fast forward to 1927, we see that piano sales are starting to decline. This is highly related to the fact that the national NBC, National Broadcasting Company in the United States, began regular radio broadcasting in 1926. So here's a new technology that came into the world that changed the way in which families were spending their leisure time. They no longer needed the piano, so sales started to decline as new technologies came in. But then we've seen this progress even further. There was another leap forward when TV was invented and started to come into people's households. Again, piano sales start to decline as we spend our leisure time differently. And then even if you go forward all the way up to today now, we can see that US piano sales at 30,000 are give or take about less than 10% of their peak sales. So if you've been in the piano industry of all this time, there's been an awful lot of change. A lot of the piano manufacturers are no longer in business. And so we could look at this over the last 100 plus years and we say, well, this has been really bad news for piano makers. And that's true, but it's been good news for lots of other types of workers. There are far more people employed in the United States today in other categories of entertainment because of the new technologies that have replaced the old technology. So nearly 500,000 people work in motion picture and sound recording in the United States today. And that's far more than ever worked in piano making. So from an industry point of view, from a labor and an economy point of view, this creative destruction process, it does destroy some jobs and some companies, but it creates oftentimes much more. And not only that for industry, but also for consumers. So, I take the epitome of entertainment being the halftime Super Bowl show. So in 2020, that was Shakira and Jennifer Lopez. And if you think from a consumer's point of view, the incredible technologies that have come about in the last 100 years since the family was sitting around the piano for their evening entertainment, and now what we can see is possible at something like the halftime Super Bowl. Incredible new technologies, and that whole creative destruction process is messy but incredibly interesting and brilliant for consumers at the end of the day. So this is what Schumpeter talked about when he was on about the creative destruction, how it's the essential fact of capitalism. And but interestingly, the technological change is never Pareto efficient. The losers are not fully compensated either by winners or by society in general. Okay, so this is kind of like underpinning of how I look at technology and entrepreneurship. So let me give you a flavor of some of the course content that you would get if you were sitting in on one of my courses. So let's start with the GBEAR class, the Global Business of AI and Robotics. This is, we find, like a really pertinent class at the moment because there's a lot of noise out there about AI and about robotics. They're talking about artificial intelligence. Is it going to save us all? Is it going to fix all of America's problems? Or is it going to start to destroy our communities? And this is across the board. We're starting to see these kinds of comments. New York Times here from a couple of weeks ago: the robots are coming, prepare for trouble. And this, we've seen these kinds of media stories, honestly, for 50 plus, maybe more than 100 years. So people are interested. They think these are really interesting technologies, but there's a lot of hype out there, both positive and negative. And so at MIT, our students are trying to look beyond the hype. And as faculty, what we're here to do is facilitate that. At MIT, we're going to take a much more thorough lens on understanding what actually is happening there. So give you a little flavor of that, how we look at that in my GBEAR classes. We take these different lenses. Okay, so one week we'll be focusing on what's the total economy effect. And so total economy thing is like, will there be enough jobs in the future? But then we try not to mix that with the individual. So for example, if a student of mine is in the class and 1 minute we're talking about will there be enough jobs in the total economy, and then we flick over and somebody wants to say, well, my parent is a truck driver, and let me tell you about their individual experience. We want all those stories to come out, but if we mix the lenses that we're using too often, it can be very difficult to have a thorough conversation. That's why we try and do it one lens at the time. And the way we look at the economy, for example, will be very different than by the time we're zoning in and looking at the individual. And there is linkages between them all. So for example, we look at the social and ethical impact. And we don't just look at this from a United States point of view, we have the global context and the international framework as well. So these are some of the various lenses we use. And within each of these, we break it down further and further and further and further. We bring in some of the world leading experts. I've had the privilege to have incredible guest speakers come into the class. Jason Furman, who is Obama's chief economic advisor. I've had the Minister of Finance, who is now the head of the European group of finance ministers. We've had some of the leading venture capitalists from Andreessen Horowitz. We've, as well as obviously some of the world leading roboticists, artificial intelligence experts. So we've had amazing guest speakers come in, and this is how we bring all these topics to life with both hyper specificity and being diligent and disciplined about how we analyze each element, but then also bringing in the people who are at the practical, at the front line of these technologies. And, for those people who are maybe on the line who don't know that much about artificial intelligence, what is it that's so interesting about it? What is it that we'll be actually looking at this, if we're at MIT? And, Michael Polanyi was an economist, and he talked about this idea that we know more than we can tell, which is really important. And so if you think about traditional computers, and essentially how they're built is that, the software is built is rules based. And there's this great example to say, the skill of a car driver. If you think of somebody driving their car, many of you at the moment, the skill of a car driver cannot be replaced by a thorough schooling in the theory of the motor car. No matter how much I tell you exactly how an internal combustion engine or carburetor works, that is not going to give you the skill of driving, because most people don't know how an internal combustion engine works, but they can drive a car. So this talks about the difference between the skills that we have and the knowledge that we have. And if we're going to embed that knowledge into a computer system, traditionally we had to be able to write rules for it. So this is why machine learning has come about, because it's really important if we're going to continue to make progress in computer applications. So, everyday life requires an immense amount of knowledge about the world to interact with it. Not all of this can be bundled into rules. So let me just give you an example of how this works. So if I was to try and teach a computer how to recognize a cat from a picture of a cat, first thing I would need to do is really describe all the rules that define a cat and how that cat is different from lots of other animals and indeed any other picture. So if we had to, in one of my classes, we spent a bit of time trying to tinker with this a little bit. And I asked my students to try and define all the rules that they would use. They'd start using definitions around the hair and then the whiskers and then the pointed ears. And for nearly every rule that we write, we end up having to write a bunch of other rules that contradict the original rules. And the whole system starts to break down. We cannot effectively teach computers to recognize cats from dogs and all other animals by writing a set of rules. So then we've had these great breakthroughs in machine learning, which is really the big area of artificial intelligence we focus on. And what we do is we show the computer, the artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithm, we show it lots of pictures of cats. And it starts to look for features within the image that are not the same maybe features that we as human beings are looking for. So the way my 2-year-old niece knows what a cat is very different than the way that an AI machine learning algorithm knows what a cat is. Essentially, it starts picking up all kinds of features within let's call it a JPEG or picture of the cat, and it then trains itself by applying weights over and over and over again until it gets good. And by good, I mean statistically accurate at identifying whether it's a cat or a dog. And so that's the fundamental of how the technology works. But then why do we care about it at the business school? Well, you know, businesses and economies are built on things got, a lot of time, massive changes in costs make a big difference. And so machine learning is changing the fundamental cost of prediction and making it an awful lot lower. And so we see lovely little examples of that. Like this is the muffins or puppies example, and we start to show loads of muffins and puppies to a machine learning algorithm, and we can actually get it to be better than human beings at predicting whether an image is of a muffin or a puppy. So that's great. And it's a little bit of fun, but so what? Okay, this is making prediction cheaper. But do we really care? Here's another little example. Is this Bill Murray or Tom Hanks? So if you just take a second and have a look at that picture, I'm going to tell you that we've trained a machine learning algorithm to be better than a human at answering this question. Is this Bill Murray or is this Tom Hanks? And so normally I'd ask for a show of hands. We have too many people on the call right now. So I'm just going to go ahead and tell you this is actually Bill Murray doing a Tom Hanks impression. So these are all trivia and they're kind of interesting. But, trying to bring this to life for businesses. This is when Donald Trump got elected. This is a picture of Donald Trump when he got elected 4 years ago. And so, I know and I've had conversations with a hedge fund manager who has access to some of the most sophisticated AI algorithms and AI teams on the planet. And they would say that in advance of the previous election, they knew that Donald Trump was going to win, even though the general polls weren't saying that. But this is what's interesting about this from a business point of view. Knowing basically means they're statistically reliable information. It's not known for a fact. It's just, statistics point of view. But they couldn't do anything with that information because being able to predict is not enough. It also requires human judgment to know what to do with that information. And that's a hugely important part of taking this technology and bringing it to life. And so to give you examples of some of the things that we delve into and some of the things we look to explore, so what's interesting about this from a business point of view? Like, let me give you a couple examples. The importance of interdependencies. So on the right hand side, I've got Netflix with a recommendation engine that's powered by machine learning. When Netflix want to introduce a new algorithm to improve their recommendation engine, they don't have to ring anybody else. They have very low interdependencies with any other firm. They can just do it. But when Google or Waymo or one of these companies want to bring out a self-driving car that's fundamentally powered by substantial machine learning, they need to do a lot of interdependencies with regulators, with insurers, with drivers, etc., etc., etc. So the speed at which these new technologies come about in our society and our economy is heavily dependent on interdependencies. So this is the type of precision I'm talking about that we start to look at these topics at MIT. Another type of thing is understanding the tolerance for errors. So on the left hand side is, Google when they're using their predictive text on email. Most people who've used Gmail will understand this. But then on the right hand side, we have a picture of a Google powered self-driving car that had an accident. And so from a human being's point of view, we are quite happy for Google to introduce and then accelerate and improve the Gmail predictive text. That's fine, bang away, because it doesn't really matter if it fails. But we have a very different tolerance for error when it comes to self-driving cars. So trying to understand all these, this is where the devil's in the detail. Final one I'll show you there is just because the technology is available and invented does not mean that it is going to automatically be introduced into the economy. So I go over and back to the United States and Europe a lot. I'd love to be able to go over and back on Concorde. It would have the amount of time it takes my flight. But Concorde no longer exists, not because the technology, but because the business model around it did not support its ongoing use and maintenance. And so, delving into all of these topics, I'm just trying to give you a flavor for it right now, of course, but we spend a lot of time delving into these. And so that's maybe how we look at the technology, but undermining a lot of that and bringing those technologies to life, which we're so passionate about at MIT, is the disciplined entrepreneurial process. And the important words there, the disciplined, we think about it very much being an endeavor in which you can build skills upon, in which you can improve and you can get better. And we do believe that it's a process. We don't believe that entrepreneurs are born with some magic gene. We think everybody can be taught to be a better entrepreneur. And we focus a lot at MIT on, yeah, there's a lot of great people around who have great ideas, but ideas are only a small part of the entrepreneurial success pie in total. So things like understanding market, execution, and team, we really, we've got a huge platform here in the Martin Trust Center, as well as all our education programs, on using entrepreneurship to bring all that stuff to life. Let me just show you this, is just to give you a small flavor of all the different courses that are available at MIT around entrepreneurship education. So there's all kinds of stuff where it's like the very beginning, nucleation, ideation of new ventures, all the way through to defining a product and learning your core skills, or it might be negotiations or communications or product design. We've got courses for all of that. Within that, I teach this one course called Collaborative Intelligence Ventures. And really what that's about is bringing together people from engineering and various different disciplines, design, etc., with business students to see, are there concepts that we can bring to life in terms of new ventures. So every year this is the second year now, but we have $100,000 prize fund that we allocate to the best performing teams coming out of all that process. We're very lucky to have an external sponsor on that. And so that's the kind of thing that you're talking about. Here's the technology, here's the underpinning of entrepreneurship. Let's get people into a room, let's come up with some ideas, and let's see if we can bring something to life. So that's kind of like the MIT way about thinking about things, and then also about doing as well. So just before I finish up, I want to talk about, look, I've talked about myself a lot, but here in the work I and we, etc., etc. But I think it's important that I also maybe just talk a little bit about some of the people I work with, because that is a huge part of what you came to MIT for. And frankly, it's not just you as students, but even as faculty myself. One of the reasons that I love MIT so much, and I find it as my intellectual and spiritual home, is because of the people I'm surrounded by the amazing students you get to meet here. Incredible, incredible people that just blow your mind. The humility, the work ethic, the focus, and the intelligence. Just generally all rounded, very, great people to work with. But not just on the student side, on the faculty side as well. I've put up 6 of the people I work most closely with, 5 of whom I teach with, and 1 of whom I do a lot of research with. So give you a flavor of the caliber of people that are just everywhere at MIT. I already mentioned Nobel Prize winners who are based at Sloan. There are plenty of courses you can take from Nobel Prize winners. Up in the top left-hand corner of your screen is Simon Johnson, who I co-teach and work very closely with. Simon was the former chief economist at the IMF, and his understanding of Washington, of international politics, international economy is incredible. Next to Simon, we've got Julie Shaw. She's a professor of aeronautical engineering here at MIT, and this just shows you it's not just Sloan people working with Sloan people. We interact with across the university. And Julie is the Associate Dean of the new College of Computing, a very exciting place to be, and an incredible visionary researcher. She's worked outside with Boeing and many other people, and one of the leading lights in the United States in her field of robotics at the moment. Beside that, I teach with Julie. Beside that, I've got Andy McAfee, a good friend of mine and someone I work closely with. I've helped him on his last couple of books, and here at MIT, he's had a hugely successful book that was published a number of years ago called Second Machine Age, and that's a big part of a lot of people's understanding about how the economy has been shifted by by digitization and new technologies. On the bottom right hand side, I've got Will Oliver, who I'm starting a new course this year. He's a professor at MIT, and he focuses on quantum computing, one of the most complicated, interesting areas, I believe, for the next couple of years and probably decades. And the two of us are collaborating this year to start a new course that's for business students, so they can get to understand this very complex subject, not as engineers, but as business people who are going to take this and bring it to life in the real world. And we're probably the first school in the world to start a course in quantum computing in a business school. Beside Will in the middle at the bottom is Luis Fidigray, who's he's a I think a lecturer or a visiting scholar at Sloan. Can't remember his exact title, but he was former Minister of Finance in Mexico. So again, he has a PhD from MIT, but again, somebody who really understands international perspectives and global trade. He was a big part of NAFTA negotiations. So for North Americans, you'll understand how big of a deal it is that. And then on the final one, I've got Gary Gensler, who is a professor of the practice here at MIT, who was a former regulator in the United States. And I'm not going to make any commentary on where I think Gary is going to be in the next couple of months, but I will just say that if anybody reads the Wall Street Journal or Reuters, you may have you may have seen Gary's name over the last day or two, as he is reputed. I'm not going to give you my personal understanding of the situation, but it has been reported that Gary is to head up Joe Biden's team on overseeing all of Wall Street, which is going to be incredibly interesting. So that's the caliber of people who are working and have worked and are at the coalface of technologies and the economy here at MIT. And it's just a real privilege to be able to work with these kinds of people. So on that, I think that probably tees it up. I've gone a little bit over my half-hour plan, but at this stage, maybe I'll open it up to questions, and I'm happy to dig into any of the topics that have been explored in this, or the people, or whatever else that might be useful.
Great, that was fantastic. So we have a bunch of questions. I'm going to get to as many as possible, but continuing on with the faculty at MIT, we sometimes see people wanting to switch careers, coming in from a business background. How do you help students bridge the gap between their business background and their technical talents, and sharpening those technical skills needed to work in this industry?
Well, it's a great question, Anne, and I think it hits at the fundamental of where business, and within that where managers and leaders and the roles that they hold within firms are changing. And so the manager of the future is not somebody who just has the skills around interpersonal skills, and maybe what traditionally we would have seen as maybe just strategy skills or leadership skills. They're going to be incredibly important, but also to have those analytical skills. So the ability, and that's really a big part of the way we look at management here at MIT. And so for people who are coming from the outside, who may have a bunch of skills already, but are looking to really refine some of those analytic skills, there's a whole host of courses that are based here around building those for the manager. Now, if there's somebody who's coming in and they've already been exposed to maybe some quite heavy quantitative work in their undergraduate, and you're coming to MIT looking to explore even further, well, there's no shortage of courses for the expert either. And we have maths departments and electrical engineering departments, computer science departments, and so the ability for people to be able to cross-register for maybe those kind of expert courses, or courses where you're trying to blend your analytical skills, maybe your finance skills, but then also try to find a home outside Sloan for it. So I think there's one part of it is the huge range of courses were out there, but I also want to re-emphasize something I talked about at the start, which is that it's not just about maybe traditional courses that people might be used to from their undergrad, where there's a professor up the front and they're talking to a bunch of students. But these action learning labs, they're a vital part of how Sloan goes about its business, because again, we believe in students not just learning, but also practicing and demonstrating. It's a very integral part of how MIT and Sloan operates. So the action learning labs, I'm part of the team that runs a lab, which is analytics lab, for one, and a whole bunch of other labs that are available. I hope that answers your question, Anne.
Great. The next question we have is on creative destruction. How does it differ between national outlooks and economies? How do these differ affect you when you're teaching at Trinity versus at MIT?
Well, that's okay. It's a lot of stuff to unpack there. How long have we got? We need another few webinars. So, look, creative destruction is a powerful force, but it underpins capitalism. And there are a bunch of other things that are important to market economies, because there is no perfect version of capitalism around the world. There's all different versions of it, different varieties of it. I do understand quite well, I would say, the Western European nations and the United States. I also have quite a bit of experience. I spent a decent amount of time in places across Asia, including China. And I suppose, when we look at creative destruction, we also have to think about institutions. Okay. And so, institutions, what we're talking about there is that, like, how is it that the people organize themselves in a country? Who do they give power to that can then set the rules of the game? And that's what institutions do. So, how the United Kingdom sets up its rules of the game, whether it be the Bank of England as an institution or whether the people vote for something like Brexit, that's constantly changing. And so creative destruction has to sit within that framework. And so, when we look to places like China, they do that very differently. But what's underpinning it at the end of the day is the macro forces that, the perennial gale of creative destruction, and also the institutions, how the Chinese decide to set up their institutions are different. So the lens that we can use to look at these, institutional lens is very important, technological lens is very important, and then there's a much more subtle one that most people will probably experience of have some innate understanding of, and that is the social one. Different countries have different populations have different attitudes to some of the underpinnings here. So, for example, in the United States, in certain cohorts, not across everywhere, but there is more of an acceptance of failure. In fact, in some quarters, it's actually glorified. And the more you fail, the more chances you can have in entrepreneurial terms of getting a successful venture. We're probably not as entrepreneurial in Western Europe as the pinnacle parts of the United States. That's just maybe one insight.
Great, excellent. So the next question that we see is about ethical AI. Could you please help elaborate how it's incorporated into your curriculum or the curriculum at MIT in general?
Well, great question. I mean, this is such a complex and interesting and important subject. And what I actually noticed is I used to teach a section, practically speaking, I'll tell you how do I incorporate it in. I used to teach a section on this myself in one or two of my classes, and I just found it could be an entire class. And in fact, in parts of MIT, it is an entire class. And so that's where I collaborate with real world class experts. Thankfully, for example, in my collaborative intelligence ventures class, I work with Julie Shaw, whose, core research, her in, focus of her academic career really is all about the I would call it the ethical and social impact of these technologies that she knows so much about. So I think it's never a case of like, how do I, you know, um, teach this as if I'm the oracle of Anathan. I think your role as an instructor a lot of the time is to bring together the right people, the right ideas, and then we discuss it as a classroom, because there are. It's another great thing about being at MIT. The amount you learn as an instructor is incredible when you teach some of these classes on importing and interesting, sometimes difficult topics. We don't come to an answer. There is no final answer. What we're trying to do is get people to think differently, be exposed to different ideas, and then they're going to take that into their careers. As maybe they're going to be managing a huge business down the road and have thousands of employees, and how they're going to think about automation hopefully will be broader.
Excellent. This question is on your teaching style. Do you have a particular teaching style, or is it a mixture between lectures, case method, and mix, or another method?
It is a lot of a mix. The I'm not as heavy into the case as, for example, you get at Harvard Business School. Certainly not on that. That's way over on one end of the spectrum. We certainly use case methodologies. But what we do is, I suppose, we're deliberately interdisciplinary. If you think about, we're not trying to discuss technology in a business school silo. We're bringing technologists, both academic researchers and practitioners, into the classroom with us. And then we're then using our skills as business people, business scholars, business students to take those technologies and understand them and apply them in different ways. So it's very current. I mean, some of the, like you said, look, there is Gary Gensler, who I am teaching with tomorrow night, and the Wall Street, according to the Wall Street Journal, he is right now a major piece of Joe Biden's presidential transition team. And so that's how live some of these things are. We've had people, I've had guest speakers, an incredible lady who runs an AI company who came into our class, and it had only been announced a couple hours before that she had raised, I can't remember, something like $55 million. So she is coming in teaching in our class as a practitioner or guest lecturer, and on the same day that they're raising these massive amounts of money. So I think my teaching style would be somewhat case study. Case study cannot keep up with that pace, frankly, in rapidly emerging areas. It's not that they're not useful; they incredibly are. And I suppose to some degree we're using the case study of real life practitioners with real life problems and trying to bring them to life. And then I'd say just generally my teaching style is, I believe my job as a instructor is not just to transmit information. Not a huge fan of that. Much more that I'm there to unlock knowledge that the students are, these are all graduate students at MIT. What I'm there is to, provide direction, unlock the, maybe challenge them a little bit, help them to unlock knowledge that's there, or that they think about things a little bit differently. And then one part now, I know it wasn't directly the question, but we spend a lot of work, and I really mean a lot of work at Sloan this year, and other universities, are doing this. But really, it's been, I've been really proud of the work the faculty have done at Sloan this year on adapting to the online reality that we're in because of COVID. And there are multiple hybrid courses, but a lot of what I'm doing is teaching remotely. And I would say, I mean, like my experience so far, since we've made the adaptions, I honestly think that the student experience is similar and in some ways better than it was before. Now, look, we're certainly losing a few elements of the in person, but we've done a lot of work to compensate for that. When COVID hit instantly and we all just switched over to Zoom, if I compare the classes I was teaching then in the middle of March, when we hadn't properly adapted, we hadn't considered the environment, and I look at now the way we're teaching and the way that we're learning how to engage students, and to I'm working with a couple of students at the moment, and as part of their work we're getting them to develop a podcast so that they can explore topics themselves. That's not the kind of thing that I was doing in pre-COVID. So I think we're adapting. I'd like to think we're adapting very well.
Excellent. The next question is about your GBEAR classes. Do they cover topics or resources, strategies to help awareness of AI and robotics in developing countries?
Certainly, we do talk. I mean, if you saw the framework that I had, there was a square, there was a triangle in the middle, and the top right hand side, we just said international. Well, okay, that's a big topic. We absolutely do explore developing economies. To give you an idea, it's not a full case study because, frankly, there's no case study out there. So we have developed this, one class. It's not a full class, but it's a big bulk of it, where we introduce the idea to the class. We set the context as the economy of Bangladesh, and we look at within that how much of their entire GDP and workforce, etc., are involved in textile manufacturing. And then we bring in this notional machine which replaces hand stitching, etc., etc. Okay, so we invent these technologies that are not that far away, and maybe we do have small cases of where they're around, but they're either not technologically capable enough today or they're not cheap enough today. But we introduce this idea to the students, and then we talk about, okay, so what happens to this economy? What happens to these people? And we take it from an economy, an industry, a firm, an individual perspective. Um, I co-teach that class with Luis Fidigare, who, like I said, was the former finance minister of Mexico. He was also the former trade minister for Mexico. So when you've got, and like I said, Simon Johnson, who was the former chief economist of the IMF. So we take a very global perspective on this. I am actually, when I think about that, there's none of us. Simon was originally from the UK, although he's been in the US a long time. Luis is from Mexico. I'm originally from Ireland. So we're thinking about this from a very global point of view. That's very normal at MIT.
Great. The next question is, since technology advancements are likely to decrease the number of jobs available in certain areas of the economy while creating jobs in other areas, can we soften the wealth disparity that happens in the short term?
Very good question. Very good question. One of the things that the market economy has been very good at is increasing the size of the pie. In general, it's hard to argue about that if we look back over the past number of decades. What the market economy in its current iteration, as societies across a lot of the rich world have implemented it, has not been good at, is splitting that pie up in an equitable way. And so I think it's one of the great challenges of our generation and the next generation. We definitely don't have any simple answers, but we spend a lot of time thinking about it and talking about it. We also try to position it within a realistic view of where the world is today. Because if we were starting from scratch and designing a new system, maybe we could design a better system, or maybe we're not just thinking of all the unintended consequences of this mythical other system that we would implement. And so we take it from where we are today, how can we make things better, and what can we do practically in the short term to actually get to a more desirable long term. Very important part of what we do, and I think you'll hear a lot of conversations about that in classes, on corridors, among students. Very important.
Do you have any particular reading lists or books that these prospects can look into?
Oh, where do I start? Um, I really like. I mean, I've helped Andy McAfee with and Eric Brynjolfsson with the last two books, but their most famous book is the one before that, Second Machine Age. I think it really, it's almost getting dated now, 2014 or 13, sometime around then. But I think it's a really good underpinning to the the um, the rapid and unprecedented change that technology has caused, and it sets it in a context of millennia, frankly, and I think it gives some really good underpinnings. So I still really like Second Machine Age, but then Prediction Machine is I think the best business book out there on AI at the moment. A couple of guys out of Toronto Business School wrote that. Really good. Yeah, Prediction Machine. That's on because you asked specifically about GBear. Anybody who's thinking of starting a business, good friend and colleague Bill Aulett. It's a very different type of book. It's called 24 Steps Disciplined Entrepreneurship. Anybody who ever personally contacts me and says, about business, I had actually done a startup and sold it myself before joining MIT. And anybody who reaches out to me thinking about entrepreneurial ventures and wants to jump on a Zoom or call, I'd say, well, happy to jump on a call, but before you do so, please make sure you've read, even quickly skimmed, Bill Aulett's book, because then we'll actually be able to have a much more useful conversation. So I'd highly recommend it.
Excellent. You talked about the podcast that you're doing with the students. Can you give any more examples of cool things your students have done as a result of your class and teaching?
Um, yeah, what do we see? I've had a bunch of students who self-organized. I would say I facilitated, but I was facilitating them. I didn't come up with the idea of a hackathon. We coming out of one of the GBear classes, we had a incredible guest speaker. Another fascinating thing, when you come visit us at Sloan, okay, maybe not right now, but when we're all on campus together in the sometime in the future, when we're in one of the classes I teach in Sloan, literally across the road, you could, I mean, if you had a good enough arm, a baseball player could throw a stone at it, is the Amazon offices where they have the lead team for the development and implementation of Amazon's Alexa is based. And of course, that's a technology that's a lot of people are familiar with when it comes to AI. So we had one of the lead guys from Amazon Alexa in speaking to us, and the group of students self-organized and ran a hackathon where they recruited other students from across MIT, and on a Saturday they collaborated with Amazon Alexa, because Alexa have this ability where in a very short amount of time you can create new Alexa skills. And so there's a bunch of business students who probably most of them did not have any coding experience, but instead of being intimidated by the fact that there's quite a steep learning curve to get from zero to hero of being a coder, instead of just accepting that, they found a capability in which they could, in a very short amount of time, basically one day, do something. It's not the same as being a brilliant coder, but they could actually bring about Amazon skills that could be embedded into the platform, released for the public, and they managed to do it in a day. So that's the kind of things that that hackathon that students would self-organize. That's really exciting when you see it. Of course, other students have actually started businesses. Like I'm trying to think of who's been a successful one. PillPack, they sold their business for a reported over $1 billion. They were back in Sloan doing their MBA. Well, one of them, what, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, something like that. Well, not in my class, but certainly in Bill's.
Great. I think this is the last question we can take, but here it is. It's been greatly debated that machine learning models are biased. As Sloan shapes global and inclusive leaders, are there any courses, resources that focus on inclusivity in technology?
Well, at the IDE, the research group I'm in, rather than necessarily teaching, but any student who comes to MIT, we're very keen on you getting involved in our programs at the research group as well. We run the Inclusive Innovation Challenge, which sounds very close to what your the questioner just asked about, and that's $1 million prize that we've been running for the last number of years, where we look for initiatives, social entrepreneurs, for profit entrepreneurs who have a social agenda from around the world, who are developing technologies or initiatives or companies where they are addressing some of this inclusivity in new technology as a challenge. So it's something that's very close to our heart. Something, we have some very generous sponsors who've put several $1 million behind that over the last number of years. The program is evolving this year, and in fact will now encompass a lot of other parts of MIT. It's been expanded into a more broad inclusivity innovation challenge. Um, and so that's why I just want to talk about the kind of stuff that goes on at MIT in terms of making sure that all this innovation that's happening, this is all great, but as my colleagues, John Gruber at the Economic School and Simon Johnson wrote a book last year called Jumpstarting America, and it looked at, like, how we're going to make sure that the prosperity that we're creating is going to be spread out equitably. And they talked about the idea that we want a rising tide, and that's what technology creates over the long term. Going back to Bob Solo's insights, we want to create a rising tide that's going to float all boats, not just the yachts. And I think that probably is the insight that I like most when we think about this, which is this is not just technology that will create more billionaires. I'm not against having billionaires, but what I am is I'm also more concerned about making sure that as many people as possible in society are benefiting from the incredibly, incredibly powerful and important benefits that are to be had. Not, it's not all perfect. Technology doesn't solve everything, and it comes with some negatives as well as positives. But in general, over the long term, I think it's been an incredible force for humans, and I think it'll that'll continue into the future. And I really do mean this, not just because I work here, but I literally cannot think of anywhere better in the world than MIT and Cambridge to explore this topic.
Great. I think any last words from you, advice, or where you see AI and technology going in the next year? And then it's unfortunately time to wrap up.
Oh, I think it's going to be a turbulent time for technology in at the regulator, at the large firm level. I think we're going to see, as we've already begun to hear for the last couple of years in Europe and begin in the United States as well. These ideas like is tech too big? They're just going to be really the kind of questions that are going to be at the forefront of a lot of the newspaper coverage, let's say. But what I'm always reminded of, and in another presentation I give, um, the the day that the paper was published, that the Tim Berners-Lee, another colleague here of ours at MIT, who invented the World Wide Web, let's call it invented, or at least he published the paper. I have the front. I got the New York Times front cover from that day, and I think it was 1991. I can't remember exact date. And what was on the front page of the New York Times on the day that the internet was effectively invented had absolutely nothing to do with the internet. So I suspect that there's two things happening over the next year. Let's call it 2 years. One is that there is going to be a focus on big tech, on its place in the world from a taxation point of view, from a monopoly point of view, regulatory environment. But then there's going to be something that's going on, probably at somewhere like MIT, with people who might be on this call inventing new technologies that it'll be another 10 or 20 years before we know how powerful and important they are. So there'll be very microscopic stuff that's going on under the radar. You know, if you get involved and you come to MIT, it would be fantastic. We'd love you to be part of that. And then there's the stuff you'll be reading about in the New York Times.
Excellent. Well, I just want to thank you all for joining us today, whether it's your morning, afternoon, or evening. As always, we hope you all are in good health. We wish you all the best, and we hope to see you at our future webinars and hopefully someday on campus. So, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you and best of luck.